Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Lords of the Fallen. This is a hack and slash dungeon crawlery kind of thing. It's in the vein of Dark Souls, of course, and it was developed by Deck13 and CI Games and published primarily by CI Games themselves, although other publishers exist for certain regions and certain platforms. And it was primarily made for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4, although apparently there is an iOS and Android version as well, and I shudder to think how terrible that is. But anyway, what you're seeing here is of course the PC version, more specifically what they're calling the Game of the Year edition. Now, I don't know what universe this got Game of the Year in, but that universe must be some sad, miserable place indeed. I mean, to give you some context, that was the same year we got the likes of Dragon Age Inquisition, Divinity Original Sin, Wasteland 2, and my personal game of that year, Transistor. And this is what somebody voted as Game of the Year? I mean, this wasn't even the best Souls-like that came out that year. That was the same year that Dark Souls 2 came out. Anyway, I'm digressing and already getting into a quality assessment before I even start talking about what the game actually is, so sorry about that, but that name bothers me. Game of the Year. No, just no. Anyway, what exactly is Lords of the Fallen? Well, it's what we now term as a Souls-like, although at the time that wasn't really much of an established subgenre. You had Demon Souls and Dark Souls, and that was pretty much it. Dark Souls 2, of course, came out the same year, but Bloodborne hadn't been released yet. So this was before you started to see a lot more developers try to pick up that formula and do their own thing with it. So how did Lords of the Fallen end up doing that? Well, it does run on a proprietary engine built by Deck13 themselves called the Fledge engine, and I honestly don't know that much about said engine, but what you end up with here in terms of visuals is actually still pretty decent even to this day. They've done a very good job with the modeling and the texture quality, and there's some nice visual effects going on. Although the art style just drives me up the wall, because on the one hand, it's like it's trying to be 40K-esque with the absolutely gigantic armor and shoulder pads and things like that, but it's mixed in with that really obnoxious fantasy art style where everything has to have ludicrous numbers of spikes on it and have weird jagged appearances where there's no conceivable way that anybody could actually use the things that they're trying to use, but because it's a fantasy game, of course they're able to use it, because, you know, magic and stuff. But of course, art style is going to be a very highly subjective thing no matter what, so that doesn't really bother me that much. It's just one of those things that annoys me, but I can deal with it. What I really can't deal with is how poorly this game runs. I'm running an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080, and the game barely really gets above 60 frames per second. Now, I know some of the problem there is that the game still has de novo DRM in it on the Steam version, and that does actually take a good probably 10 frames per second off of the performance, but even then, the performance shouldn't be around 60 frames per second, sometimes dipping below that. It should be well above 60 frames per second, given how old the game is and how powerful my hardware is. I mean, on other games that are more technically advanced than this and much more recent than this, I'm getting way higher frame rates even on max settings, so I don't know what they did here as far as optimization goes, but it is problematic. Not to mention the game is a bit glitchy, and I have actually run into a couple of crashes as well, so it's not exactly the most stable. Moving on from visuals and technical aspects, the sound design is generally okay. I mean, sound effects themselves do what they need to, and there's nothing particularly impressive about them, and the music is some fairly generic dark fantasy styled stuff that works okay, but then there's the voice acting, which, while certainly not outright bad, is definitely on the rougher side and definitely marks it as more of a middle market title. But of course the real questions are, how are the story and characters, and what's the gameplay like? And the story is pretty much non-existent. I mean, you get more off of the Steam page than you actually get in the game itself. In the game itself, it gives you a cutscene at the beginning that has your character stomping forward in the snow and being like, "Hear my cry of defiance, gods!" And that's pretty much it. It starts the game and you wander into a monastery looking for someone for some reason, and while I haven't gotten far enough into the game to really know what that reason actually is, I do know that the basic setup for the game is that Harkin is a criminal whose tattoos on his face denote his sins or whatever, and thus he's a social outcast, but it's up to him to save the world from this demonic invasion that has been spilled upon the world by some dark fallen god. Frankly, it's really hard to give a crap about the story when the developers clearly didn't give much of a crap about it themselves. I mean, you do have some degree of dialogue when you're going up with the various characters, and you can ask them about certain things that they were doing, but none of it's really relevant to what's actually going on. And even then, there's no opportunity for character development or any sort of personal dialogue options, so it's definitely not a role-playing game when you get down to it. But even from what you do get, generally it raises more questions than it answers, and the characters themselves barely have any personality to them at all, so you're really just not going to give too much of a crap about anybody that's doing anything. So ultimately, everything does fall to the gameplay. Now, what exactly is on offer here? Well, if you start up the game, then you have a selection of 3 different class types and 3 different magic types, each of which mostly corresponds to the class types, but you can mix and match to your heart's content, really. For class type, it's basically split among 3 different armor types, and of course the associated weapons that you might be using with them. So the warrior is primarily focused on big, heavy weapons, and of course the heaviest armor. Cleric is the more middle of the ground, which focuses more on stuff like hammers and maces, and also medium armor, and then of course the rogue is wearing light armor and uses the lighter, faster weapons like daggers and such like that. The 3 magic types available are Deception, Solace, and Brawling, which correspond to, of course, rogue, cleric, and warrior respectively, but you can mix and match them as well, with Brawling being focused more on offensive, Solace being focused more on defensive, and Deception being focused more on just kind of gaining the upper hand in general. And the game will ultimately generate a class for you based on what you selected as your sort of basic identity of warrior, rogue, or cleric, and the magic type that you decided to choose. So for example, if you choose Solace Magic and the warrior, then it will actually make you a paladin. It's pretty straightforward, and then once you hop into the game, it gives you a selection of basic starting equipment, and if you have the DLCs, then it will throw a bunch of extra stuff in your inventory as well, and it throws you right into the game with a basic combat tutorial because it immediately throws you up against an enemy. And the combat system is clearly derivative of the style that was present in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, where you have a button each for light and heavy attacks, as well as a button for defense and a button for attacking with whatever other item you have equipped, whether that be a shield or a gauntlet or even a secondary weapon, because you can actually dual wield certain weapons as well. Every time you swing your weapon, whether it be a light or heavy attack, it will take a certain amount of energy, which is what they're terming the stamina in this. And of course, if you defend and take hits from enemy attacks but still manage to keep your defense up, then it will also detract from your energy until eventually your energy bottoms out and you can pretty much no longer do anything. And of course, sprinting, dodging, and jumping all take up energy as well. Like in the Souls games, the only way you can jump is if you sprint first, although they're not bound to the same button in this, so that's a good thing. But it's still a really clumsy and awkward way of handling a jumping mechanic, so that ends up being more annoying than anything else. But then there's the one mechanic that's a bit conspicuous by its absence, which, as far as I can tell, there's no parry mechanic like there is in the Dark Souls games, where if you swing your shield out at just the right time when an enemy is attacking, it'll actually knock their attack off balance, and then you can follow that up with a devastating counterattack. That doesn't seem to happen in this, at least as far as I can tell, although it does still have the backstab mechanic where you can get behind an enemy at a certain angle and use a light attack to go into a canned animation, where in this particular game you're actually completely invincible while you're doing it, by the way, and you'll just do a ton of damage to them, although it may not necessarily kill them depending on what weapon you're using and what enemy you're fighting. Aside from those basic actions, you also have a button specifically for casting magic, and of course you can cycle through all your different spells, of which you can have 4 within your given track. And there's also a button for using whatever consumable item you have equipped, which is usually going to be health potions, although you can certainly put other things in that slot as well. You have 3 basic stances available to you: wielding a weapon with 2 hands, wielding a weapon with 1 hand plus a shield in the other hand, or wielding a weapon in 1 hand and a gauntlet in the other. The gauntlet itself has 3 different fire modes, and it goes off of your magic meter, which is an additional thing on top of both health and the energy meter. But I didn't really get too much use out of the gauntlet. I found it to be fairly underwhelming and not really all that useful, so I just ended up using normally sword and shield or whatever the equivalent was. I also didn't really mess around too much with the dual wielding. If you switch over to what is ordinarily the 2-handed grip with most of the other weapons, if you're wielding a dagger or a short sword, then you'll actually pull out a separate one in end up dual wielding them. I usually found the shield was much more important in that instance, so I just ended up sticking up with one weapon and a shield most of the time, except in the case of daggers, because with a dagger it doesn't really matter all that much. Once you're given the basic rundown on the controls, then you're just thrown into the game and expected to figure out pretty much everything else for yourself, although it does eventually tell you how to use the leveling system once you beat the first boss, where you spawn this large crystal in the air and it ends up allowing you to bank your experience into one of two separate tracks in order to give yourself attribute points or spell points respectively, and you can then use that to improve your various attributes like, of course, strength and agility and things like that, or you can put it into your various spells in order to either increase the power of those spells, or if you haven't gotten to that point yet, you can also unlock new spells, or you can just hang on to them for later use if you just don't have the requisite faith stat. You can also simply go up to one of those floating crystals and just activate it in order to replenish all of your health potions, bring yourself up to maximum health, and to reset your experience point bonus, which is something that goes up every single time you kill an enemy, and the idea is to push this sort of risk-reward gameplay where you just go through and see how long you can go without just getting clobbered. Because if you, of course, get downed, then you respawn at the last checkpoint, and any experience points you hadn't banked up to that point are dropped on the ground wherever you ended up dying. Obviously, you can go back to where you died and find your ghost and press the activate button when you're next to it in order to retrieve all of your lost experience, but if you don't do that within a certain amount of time, then the ghost actually vanishes and that experience is lost forever. Most of this is going to be fairly familiar to you if you've played any Souls-like game before, but what really sets this game apart from most of the other games that are either inspired by the Souls series or are part of the Souls series itself is the unbelievably sluggish and boring combat system. Now don't get me wrong, Dark Souls is a really sluggish game. Most of the time it feels like you're moving through molasses, and if you're swinging a two-handed weapon around, it feels like it must weigh about 30 tons because you're just swinging it so slowly. But if you're swinging a one-handed weapon around in Dark Souls, it's generally what I would describe more as deliberate. It's not necessarily super slow like it is with the two-handed weapons, but there's a noticeable wind-up and you have to be ready for that. But you can still do some fairly quick combos. In Lords of the Fallen, unless you're using daggers or short swords, which swing at roughly the same pace as all of the one-handed weapons in the Souls games, everything feels like it's actually not made necessarily of 30 tons, like in, say, Dark Souls' two-handed weapon sense. No, it's more like about 47,000 tons, because you swing literally everything except daggers and short swords extremely slowly in this. And if you're using any of the dedicated two-handed weapons, like, say, the great swords, then you're just not gonna hit anything at all, because they are so slow and the wind-up is so intense, even on the light attacks, that you just can't hit something before it moves out of the way. Meanwhile, the enemy is not burdened by this issue. Instead, they get to swing about 3 or 4 times faster than you do. You may think that would make the game artificially BS difficult, but it only does that if you are stupid enough to keep using any of the two-handed weapons or even the one-handed weapons that aren't short swords or daggers. If you use short swords, for example, then sure, you're not going to do a whole lot of damage per hit, but you can certainly swing fast enough that you'll actually hit something before it either moves out of the way or gets its shield back into position to where you just are not going to do any damage to it at all. And you find out almost immediately that every single bit of your combat tactics is going to devolve into one simple process. It's going to be circle strafe around the enemy until eventually they start going into an attack loop and can't get out of it, then move into just the right spot you need in order to trigger the backstab mechanic, and just repeat this until everything is dead. And the only thing that really changes when you go up against the boss enemies in this game is that the boss enemies are immune to the backstab mechanic, so instead of just going up and using the backstab, you just go up behind them and start whacking them a few times, and then back up, avoid their attacks, go in behind them, whack them a few more times, and repeat the process until eventually they fall over too. Oh, and unless you're wearing only light armor or no armor at all, don't even bother using the dodge roll, because you'll just be so ludicrously slow that it just won't matter. You'll get hit anyway, because the iframes are only at the beginning of the animation, and if you're not out of the range of the attack when the attack comes through, well, you're just gonna get hit anyway. And before you ask, no, wearing lighter armor does not make your attacks quicker. It only makes the movement and dodging slightly quicker. And hell, even if you are wearing light armor and are dodging around all the time, it may not necessarily matter, because the hitboxes are so wonky that you'll notice numerous occasions where an enemy will swing, it will be nowhere near where you're actually sitting, but you'll still get hit anyway. And as for magic, well, you can't just use that indefinitely. You can't actually be a proper spellcaster in this, because whenever you cast a spell, it takes up a huge amount of your magic pool, and then it has a very, very long cooldown before you can use it again. So you'll cast your spell, which takes an absolutely ludicrous amount of time, by the way, and it can be interrupted if you're in the middle of casting it and somebody comes up and whacks you upside the head. So that's always fun too. And then you just find that the spells themselves really aren't all that effective anyway. I found the one that spawns a decoy to be the most useful because it's kind of a crapshoot as to whether it'll actually work, but if it does, then the enemies will attack it instead of you, so at least you can get behind him and do the backstabs then. But none of the others seemed to help all that much, and the casting time was so long, and the time where they were in effect was so short, that it just wasn't worth casting them. This of course means that the game devolves into really just its melee combat, and that involves, again, just circle strafing around things until they leave themselves open for you to go in and whack them upside the head a couple of times. And it just ends up being ludicrously boring when it's not just being outright frustrating. And to make matters worse, eventually they start throwing enemies at you that have shields, and they're completely immune to damage from the front and barely leave themselves open to attack, so the game devolves into an even more tedious slog when they show up, and it was right around there that I just decided to stop playing the friggin' thing, because all it was doing was pissing me off. And even if I did force myself to finish this game and get to the end, what exactly would I get there? Just who knows how many more hours of that extremely repetitive, extremely boring, or outright frustrating combat system with these bits of absolutely vapor-thin story and characters sprinkled in between. And the even funnier thing about this is that I thought at first that me just being annoyed at this thing was because I'm just not really into the Souls-like gameplay style to begin with, but I went out and asked people who are into the Souls-like gameplay style, who are huge fans of Dark Souls and Bloodborne and such like that, and even they can't stand Lords of the Fallen, precisely because it is so sluggish and repetitive. And that just leads me to the conclusion that Deck 13 Interactive decided that they were going to make a Souls-like game because they just liked the way Dark Souls was, but they had absolutely no understanding of why people actually liked the Souls games to begin with, so they just slapped this piece of crap together, thought it was good enough, and threw it out on the market, and apparently it sold well enough to fund a sequel of sorts, in the sense that they made another Souls-like game called The Surge, which from what I've seen and from what I've heard is just as sluggish, if not more sluggish than this, which is downright baffling. I mean, think about it this way. I was able to force myself through about 16 hours or so of the original Dark Souls, even though that game was sluggish and boring and mostly just annoyed me to play, but I didn't even manage to make it 5 hours into Lords of the Fallen before I just gave up on it entirely. Do not bother picking this game up. It's slow, it's boring, it's irritating, and if you're looking for a Souls-like game, then there are far better options out there. I mean, hell, there's 3 games in the Dark Souls series now. There's, of course, Demon's Souls, there's Bloodborne, and then even outside of From Software stuff, there's games like Nioh. So you have plenty of options out there that are better polished, faster, and more enjoyable than this piece of crap. So there you have it, folks. My thoughts on Lords of the Fallen. It's one of those things that's been plaguing my backlog for a while now. And as you no doubt know, I've still got a lot of backlog to catch up on, so I'm actually going to go ahead and get right back to it, and get back into doing the October stuff, which is more horror-themed. It may not necessarily be horror games, but at least stuff with a horror theme about it. So, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll catch you all in later videos.